Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. History is rarely a neat collection of dates and simple consensus. More often than not, it's a battleground, a continuous high-stakes war over who gets to control the narrative of the past, and then who is forced into silence. Well, in today's show, we're going to untangle this very conflict, and we're going to begin in India, where corporate streaming platforms have become the latest front line for state censorship. Yes, indeed, that highly anticipated biographical film chronicling the raw, data-driven truth of Punjab's extrajudicial past has been abruptly wiped from domestic screens, as we know. It is a modern act of digital erasure that has reignited grassroots fury and driven thousands onto the streets in open defiance. So in today's show, we'll take a look at the unfolding fallout from the cancellation of the film Satluj. And talking of history, KPS Gill. Well, Indians call him Super Cop. We call him the Butcher of Punjab. In the wake of that film Satluj, Hindutva is washing social media with praise for this brutal bastard of a man, and apologies for my language. We'll take a look at the truth of KPS Gill and why he earned that well-deserved title of Butcher. And as Modi gears up for his visit to Australia and New Zealand, we'll take a look at how Hindutva are already trying to control the narrative in the Southern Hemisphere. All this and more on today's show. And of course, at the end of the show, we'll take a look at loads of great comments. And of course, you may have realised today's show is not live. Just an exception this week is that Thursday's show is not a live show. The rest, of course, are live. But today's show, for various reasons that I won't bother boring you with, it is a pre-recorded one. But that doesn't mean you still can't stay glued and watch and leave loads of comments. Much appreciated. But of course, we will be back on Monday with our normal live show. So anyway, let's get underway. And as I said, quite a lot to get through today, as usual. And it is, yes, of course, this battle for the narrative, for control of the narrative. And it's interesting because an absolute firestorm has just erupted across the digital landscape and across the entertainment industry as a whole, because, in fact, even across the whole Sikh diaspora. It is, of course, this story about this film, Satluj. But more fundamentally, it's bigger than just this film, of course, because really the furore, the ignition of so much has been written and said and recorded over the last few days is more about the bigger story than this simple film. It is, of course, it's a story about just the raw power, state power, corporate fear, and of course this ongoing war, as I referred to in the introduction, over historical memory. The victors write history, as we well know. So, of course, this film, just a few days ago, this film, Satluj, starring Diljit Dosanjh, that global superstar. It was released last Friday on Z5, that big OTT streaming platform, Z5. And the film, as I'm sure most of you are fully aware, it chronicles that incredibly heroic and very heavy, but ultimately tragic story of by Jaswant Singh Kalra. And for those of you who have followed the production of this project, you know, of course, all the way through, it's been dogged by this multi-year battle of all these obstacles thrown in its way to stop it being shown. The Central Board of Film Certification in India did everything basically it could to try and prevent this film coming out. Its original title, Punjab, or in fact the original title was Galagara. It was then changed to Punjab 95, and the State Censor Board held the film hostage, basically, demanding over 120 cuts before they said they would release it. But originally they said they just wanted 21 major cuts. And then they came back and said, no, actually we want 127. So they kept moving those goalposts. And the board explicitly objected to the film's name. They objected to its dialogue. They objected to its direct depiction of state-sponsored violence during that era, terrible years, the 1980s and 1990s in Punjab. And so, in a very calculated move, it has to be said, and well done to the film's producers, in this sort of move to preserve the artistic and historical integrity of the story, the filmmakers did actually find a way to bypass the traditional theatrical release altogether, bypass these obstacles. They basically worked their way around these obstacles put in their path by the censorship board. And they renamed the film Satluj, They aim to leverage the slightly more flexible regulatory framework of streaming platforms to deliver the film to the public with no cuts at all. So this is, or it was, the original uncut film. And so for 48 hours, as you guys know, it worked. It went out there. It was released on Z5 and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people globally, and of course within India, downloaded it. It premiered on July the 3rd, that was last Friday. And of course the response initially was huge. But then, of course, the trapdoor snapped shut. Sunday evening, Indian subscribers logging into Z5 were met with a blank screen. And the title had then been completely wiped from the domestic Indian catalogue. But it was still, of course, visible to international viewers through Z5 Global. And it was, well, as I said in yesterday's show, it was a classic, typical act of corporate capitulation by Z5. Behind closed doors, of course, it was India's Ministry of Information and Broadcasting invoked that really controversial piece of legislation, another one in India, to join that whole raft of controversial legislation. It was the IT rules of 2021. So the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting basically pulled the plug. They issued an emergency compliance directive to Z5 with a very simple argument. Changing the title, utilising an online streaming service that creators had illegally bypassed the regulatory objections of the censor board. So, unsurprisingly, faced with the threat of losing their broadcasting licence in India, or facing obviously huge fines, then Z5 had no choice. They did exactly what any large corporation would do when squeezed by an authoritarian state structure. They said, OK, they bowed their heads, hit delete, and that was it. So, interestingly though, the good news is, for India, the damage has been done. Because, of course, the film went far and wide. And if the authorities in Delhi believe that pulling a movie off a streaming application would erase that conversation, well, they are sorely mistaken. They've completely miscalculated the reality, the ground reality of Punjab's political landscape. And they've always struggled really to understand it, frankly. The corporate takedown by Z5, the takedown of that film, didn't, of course, silence the narrative. Instead, as is often the case in these situations, it acted as a massive catalyst. It instantly reignited grassroots activism. It brought protesters directly out there onto the street. It ignited anger, motivation from the people. Within hours of the film being taken down, major political, social organisations inside Punjab said, right, that's it. Were mobilising, and they mobilised a massive response. The Shiromani Akali Dal, the SAD, Warriors Punjab Day, likewise, launched coordinated public demonstrations right across most of the cities, including Emirates, Jalandhar, Chandigarh. And protesters gathered outside the administrative offices, the regional offices of Z5 and, of course, of the government, holding posters of Jaswant Singh Kalra, and shouting slogans and holding banners of slogans against what they termed an aggressive, systematic campaign of cultural censorship by the Modi administration. And I do have a quick excerpt for you. Here we go. So thanks to Punjab TV for that little excerpt. But anyway, you get a flavour of obviously what was going on there. And the angle being pushed out there in those protests on the streets, it's very clear. Activists are pointing out the blatant hypocrisy of the Indian state's policy. They're asking that very uncomfortable question. Why is it that films that openly vilify minority communities, or films that promote hyper-nationalist, state-approved propaganda, are given free rein? They're given free passes, tax incentives, massive promotional pushes by the government itself. But when it comes to a film that actually tries to tell a factual, documented human rights story from the perspective of the victims in Punjab, and there's the clue there, is treated as a threat to national security. Because, of course, God forbid that Punjab could actually be allowed to tell the truth of its victimisation under the Indian state. And on the ground, speakers are taking this opportunity to frame this ban not as an isolated legal dispute over simple certification. It's a lot more of that. It is, of course, a direct continuation of the Indian state's historical overall policy toward Punjab. And they're using this situation as a prime example to highlight, not just to the Indian audience, but to the global audience now, and this is why it's important, arguing that the Indian government is terrified of the current generation of youth connecting with those awful realities of the 1980s and 1990s. They don't want the young generation of Indians, particularly Punjabis, to be told about the horrors that the Indian state perpetrated on their families, on their older generations. They've always tried to bury it, to hide it, to reframe it, to lie about it, basically. So these protests have effectively transformed this film from just a simple piece of commercial entertainment into something a lot more significant. It is now a vital symbol of civil rights and political resistance. And it proves that the more the state tries to bury a story, the more desperate the public will always become to tell that story. It's the law of unintended consequences. It is the typical predictable backlash. When a state tries to throw authoritarian weight onto something, if it tries to ban something, what happens? It has the opposite effect. It's played out over and over again. Prime example, silly example, but just to highlight how this works. Here in the UK, in the old days, if you produce a pop song that had some rude words in it, the BBC would ban it. So what happened then? Everybody wanted to listen to it. They went out and bought it. So quite often, every time the BBC banned a song, it went to number one because it had the opposite effect, the ban. It promoted people to go out and buy it and listen to it. And that is exactly what's played out here, is that you ban this film, everybody then wants to see it. If not, just out of curiosity, why have they banned it? Our work is done, as they say. So, as I say, it's actually this wonderful law of unintended consequences. And the political groups have, as I said, filled the streets around Punjab now. And the religious leadership of the community have actually taken a really bigger step forward, really the phrase in English is to stick two fingers up to the Indian state, which is basically, it's quite a crude way of saying they're going to defy the ban. And they've basically moved from symbolic protest into something a little bit more direct, a little bit more active defiance of this state censorship. The Delhi Sikh Gurdwara Management Committee, the DSGMC, alongside support from the SGPC, issued their own hugely blistering public condemnations of the ban. But it didn't stop at words. What they've done, it's I have to say, a very brave move, and well done to them for doing this. But as I say, it's very typical of the Sikh community. You know, it never fails to impress just how defiant and resilient the Sikh community are. In the face of this ban, what have they done? They've totally blindsided the government's digital censors. And the DSGMC president, a guy called Harmeet Singh Kalka, just announced that the community would refuse to acknowledge the state-imposed ban. And they have formally instructed its regional Gurdwara bodies and local youth wings across Delhi and neighbouring states to utilise international networks, download as many copies as they can around the world, outside India obviously, of Satluj from global streams, and then to organise completely free, large-scale public screenings. I mean, how joyful this is. This is joyful protest, I have to say. This is, and I'm going to use that crude English phrase again, this is sticking two fingers up to the authoritarian regime in Delhi, saying you cannot ban the truth. You cannot and will not silence us. So this, as I say, this is a joyful outpouring of democratic freedom. So well done to them. It is a deeply significant move, of course, because Gurdwaras themselves, they're not commercial movie theatres. They're, of course, places of spiritual, social, structural heart of any community. They serve a very important purpose, obviously, spiritually speaking, and communally speaking. But converting these places into essentially makeshift theatres, screening rooms, the leadership's been quite clever, because the bypassing the state's ability to regulate content. What they're saying, effectively, is they're telling the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, yeah, you can control Commercial organisations, you can shut down those servers of commercial giants like Z5, but you have no control, no jurisdiction over our institutions, over our religious institutions. What goes on inside our four walls is not your business. So the DSGMC plans to pair these public screenings with specialised educational seminars. And these sessions, aimed directly at students across schools, colleges, they're deliberately designed to analyse the specific human rights reports and legal cases championed by Jaswant Singh Kalra. So basically they've said to the Indian state, we're showing it within our gurdwaras and places of worship as an educational tool. This isn't a commercial theatre, cinema, whatever. This is part of an educational syllabus. Beat that if you can, which is obviously a very dangerous thing to dare the Indian government, because they quite often will take you up on that dare, and it usually involves violence and brute force and illegality. But anyway, we will see. But what it does prove is who has the moral high ground here. Once again, the Sikh community takes the moral high ground and wins a democratic, legal battle once again. It is a brilliant tactical move, I have to say, because by attempting to completely erase a movie, the Indian state has basically accidentally forced the religious and educational infrastructure of the Sikh panth to institutionalise the very history the government want to hide. In other words, it becomes an official part of some sort of educational syllabus, whereas the state's trying to bury it and hide it away because they don't want the young to know about it. They don't want the young to discover the truth. So they've basically forced the institutions of the Sikh community to say, right, okay, we will make it a formal part of our curriculum, our educational curriculum. Every young Sikh then must watch this film and be educated about the stories behind it. So it's basically driven it into the most sacred, untouchable spaces of the diaspora. It's now made it completely immune to the IT rules of New Delhi. It's genius. Well done, guys. So, by Jaswant Singh Kalra, the man himself, we talked a lot about him in the past, and I'm sure most of you, there can't be anybody left who doesn't know what Bhai Jaswant Singh Kalra did. But for those one or two of you in the world who might not know, he was a heroic man, just an ordinary man. He died over 30 years ago. And his work that he got up to has just shaken the Indian state to the core. Hence why all this, even now, all these years later, his legacy still terrifies the Indian state. Why does the ghost of this enormous hero, the Shaheed, continue to terrify the Indian state, even now, all these years later? Well, the answer is the specific forensic nature of what he did, the work that he did. He was no military commander. He was just a simple bank director, I gather. He worked in a bank. And he was also a meticulous human rights researcher. And it all started when, in the bank, he noticed that some of his work colleagues just didn't appear one day after another. Just one by one, they all started disappearing over time. There's no explanation, no record of their disappearance, nothing official. They literally just disappeared off the face of the planet. And he thought, what's going on? So just as an ordinary man, he went and investigated it. And he was armed literally with nothing but a notepad, some public records that he dug out, and of course, motivated by this huge sense of justice, he then went round. It's very clever how he did it, because of course the police had been very careful. When they'd extrajudicially tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands of Sikhs in Punjab during those years, under the regime of the Butcher, KPS Gill, they'd been very careful about hiding any evidence. These people literally vanished. So he realised, hang on, they can't just vanish. He went to crematoria and he asked around the crematorias, particularly around Amritsar, Tarn and Majita. And he quietly asked questions, and he discovered that thousands of young Sikh men, tens of thousands of young Sikh men who've been picked up by security forces in illegal, undocumented raids, usually at night, were being systematically executed. They were tortured first, then executed in custody, then logged as unidentified bodies, and then secretly cremated, using wood fuel extorted from local municipalities. Now, of course, all that evidence had been buried, except for the crematoria records. The police didn't realise. Oh yeah, to use the pun, where there's smoke, there's a fire. And Cowra didn't just make emotional claims. He brought the raw, undeniable data. He actually went round all the crematoria in that region and documented in forensic detail all these individuals and the numbers of individuals who had been basically anonymised and how many had been anonymously cremated. And through his forensic work, he exposed the names of the victims, the vehicle logs of the police stations, even the exact amount of wood purchased to burn the evidence of this state-sponsored murder. So he collected this enormous set of data, the actual evidence that's totally presentable in the courts of law to condemn the Indian state for being guilty of mass murder, genocide effectively. So he did this, and then he travelled to Canada and the UK actually to present this definitive proof in 1995. And he stood up in front of particularly the Canadian Parliament, and for the first time people in the West heard the truth. He broke the carefully manufactured illusion that India was operating as this sort of flawless rule of law democracy. He exposed in exquisite detail the institutional machinery of genocide. And for that crime, when he returned back to Punjab, he was then abducted himself from his home by Punjab police in broad daylight. He was tortured for weeks in a remote police station, and then he was shot dead and dumped in a canal, basically becoming a victim of the exact same system of enforced disappearance he'd spent his life exposing. So this is why his memory is so important to keep alive, and likewise why his memory is such a mortal threat to the current ruling ideology of India. The modern Indian state narrative is built entirely on a myth that the violence of the 80s and 90s was some sort of external foreign-funded security issue. It was a bunch of militants. They were terrorists. And then it was successfully and cleanly put down by a heroic police force. But of course, we all know that is not the truth. Jaswant Singh Kalra's legacy absolutely destroyed that myth. His work has proved to the world from 1995 onwards through to 2026 and beyond that the state of India operated as an illegal, lawless, murderous enterprise that engaged in the mass extermination of its own citizens. So when you get somebody like Diljit Dosanjh, who brings that specific, evidence-driven historical truth to life on a mainstream platform, that is why it threatens to collapse this whole narrative, this BS narrative of the Indian state, in front not just of millions and tens or even hundreds of millions of Indians, but hundreds of millions of people around the world. Their illusion of India, this great democracy, is shattered when they learn the truth of what India actually did during those years in living memory. So the state's not censoring this film Satluj because they're worried about public order. They're censoring it because they're absolutely terrified that if the youth of today discover the true scale of those crimes committed against their own families, the entire moral authority of the state just disintegrates. So they're fighting a war against a movie because they are losing the war against the truth. So well done, obviously, by Jaswant Singh Kalra in the first place, but to everybody associated with this project and all the organisations now that are spreading the truth of this message. It's fantastic now. As I say, you cannot ever beat the truth. The truth always prevails. Now then, there was another dark, dirty, disgusting stain on India's history. That's this man. And I've been quite scathing about this guy. And that, I have to say, it's always, you always got to question, never judge by appearance. But when I see this guy, it's sometimes you just know instinctively, when you see somebody, you look at their face, some innate sixth sense, spiritual instinct, whatever it is, you just know when you see somebody evil and dangerous. And this is this guy. I came into this whole Sikh environment never having known anything about this guy, KPS Gill. And the instant I looked at his face, I just knew. That's why in my introduction, I used a very rude word to describe him. Because I've met in my life people like him with that look. And I cannot describe it. You just have to see it. And I'm sure that there are those of you in the audience, when you see all the photos, not just this one, photo after photo after photo, there is just something in that man's eyes that you just know. You can judge instantly what sort of man this guy was. Which actually, ironically, made him very good at his job. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm actually going to now look at the legacy and the truth of this guy, KPS Gill. Because I want to try to dismantle the counter-narrative that's being built by the Indian establishment about this guy. Because I have noticed in the last few days, particularly when it comes to the Satluj film, on social media, whenever there's posts and lots of Khalistanis and Sikhs have posted up about the film and told the story, and then all the Hindutva and loads of Hindus pile in, and of course loads of posts have gone up as well, talking about KPS Gill himself, and you just get comment after comment. This guy was a super cop. He was a hero. He knew how to deal with these militant terrorists. They idolise this guy. And this is again, it brings back, I won't say memories, I wasn't alive in the 1930s, but it resonates with what happened in the 1930s when people idolised Adolf Hitler, a man who arguably has been one of the most evil men to have, graced this planet, that's the wrong word, to have trod this planet. People idolised Adolf Hitler. And Hindus idolise this guy with that same sort of zeal, that same blind zeal. It's terrifying. And the comments I've seen on social media are absolutely frightening. Anyway, because the memory of Bhai Jaswant Singh Kalra obviously represents the truth, the raw, inconvenient truth of what happened during that time. But the legacy of this man, Kanwar Pal Singh Gill, KPS Gill, serves as that myth used to justify that decades-long policy of murder. For decades, of course, mainstream media in India, analysts, state historians have canonised, they've idolised this guy. They've called him super cop. And he served 2 high-profile terms as the Director General of Punjab Police between 1988 and 1995, those crucial years. And he's credited in official textbooks with single-handedly crushing the Khalistan insurgency and restoring normalcy to what they describe as a fractured state. So his strategy, and it was often referred to, it became known as the Gill Doctrine in international security circles, it's actually celebrated as a masterclass in counterinsurgency. It was an iron-fisted, no-nonsense approach that favoured immediate tactical results over any sort of bureaucratic delays, administrations, whatever, even legal process. But of course, you peel back the layers of that state narrative. You have a look at the dark underbelly and look at the truth. Of course, there is a much darker reality that emerges from his story. The peace that KPS Gill restored was not achieved through the rule of law by any stretch of the imagination. It was only achieved through its total calculated suspension. There was no rule of law in Punjab during his reign. Under his leadership, the Punjab Police effectively transformed itself from a civil law enforcement agency into an unaccountable paramilitary force operating completely outside the bounds, not just of the Indian Constitution, but outside the bounds of any rule of law. And the state architecture under this man didn't just fight militancy, it then institutionalised an entire system of extrajudicial terror. Essentially, they became terrorists, state terrorists. Constitutional protections, the law, were just treated as luxuries that the state couldn't afford. They just rejected anything to do with the rule of law. They became the law, and he became the law. So the reality, the operational reality of the Gill Doctrine, as it was known, was defined by a series of informal, highly dangerous, highly lethal mechanisms that were designed to, of course, deliberately then bypass the judicial system entirely. In other words, his operations were all designed to avoid being accountable under law. It was intentional. It was a deliberate choice. He chose the path. He designed his operations to avoid the system entirely, to avoid prosecuting suspected militants in court. A process, of course, that then required evidence, witnesses, normal legal protocols. And instead, his apparatus established a completely different, parallel system of summary justice. And this parallel system relied heavily on several frightening tactical pillars. He had what was called the bounty system. He actually instituted an unofficial bounty system. To incentivise his men on the ground, his police, he introduced an aggressive cash reward system. Police officers were awarded financial bonuses, often up to 50,000 rupees, which was a fortune in those days, for the elimination of what he called dreaded terrorists. He basically commercialised murder. He commercialised murder through so-called law enforcement. And it had, of course, immediate catastrophic consequences on Punjab. It basically created a system of financial incentive for murdering Sikhs. Every time you murder a Sikh, you get a bonus. I mean, I just shake my head in disbelief. It incentivised police officers, even low-level officers, to conduct arbitrary arrests, stage these mock encounters that then transformed young, innocent Sikh men into targets for liquidation, for a bonus, for cash. He basically put a bounty on any Sikh's head. And then he had a shadow network that became known as the Cats. The police extensively recruited people that then bore this sort of nickname of the Cats. Basically, they were former activists who then became, or they turned to become undercover state assets. In other words, they were turned by the state to work for the state. And they were offered a simple choice. We will torture you and then execute you. Or we will give you complete immunity and lots of money if you come and work for us as a state-directed hitman. And that is what they did. These Cats were people that they recruited within the Sikh community under threat of execution. You either work for us and we'll reward you, or we'll kill you. And these operatives infiltrated villages, Gurdwaras, you name it. They had no choice if they wanted to stay alive. But they themselves extrajudicially executed anybody associated with the insurgency. They committed acts of violence, of course, to intentionally discredit the whole broader political movement in the eyes of the public. False flag things as well. So basically they were spies and operatives for this man. And then, of course, accountability. This word accountability that just vanished. Arrest procedures were systematically ignored. Detainees were intentionally left out of official police station logs, so their names were never entered on any official register. They moved through a network of secret interrogation centres to prevent any human rights lawyers or any family members from ever actually seeing them or even discovering that they're actually there. And then if the suspect died under interrogation, as often most of them did, thousands if not tens of thousands did, the body was not returned to the family, and instead it was sent off to one of these crematoria to be burnt anonymously. You know the word I'm trying to say. Basically, they were destroying any forensic evidence that could ever be used in future against them. And Amnesty International, unsurprisingly at the time, they said torture was widespread. It was used both as a substitute for investigation and as punishment. When detainees died in police custody, the police organised the post-mortems and the cremations before any independent investigation could be carried out into the cause of death. One of many pieces of evidence that obviously came up. So anyway, but ultimately, one of the greatest misconceptions of this man, KPS Gill, is that his brutal methods were just some sort of isolated response to what was happening in Punjab at the time. But no, it wasn't. In reality, his career, actually, as a man, this is why I'm quite rude about this man. And you say, mustn't speak ill of the dead. Sorry, but this man deserves it. You know, we all speak ill of Hitler. We should speak ill of KPS Gill. The man was an evil man. Because his past shows it. His career reveals itself a broader, systematic pattern in his own life, and particularly within the Indian deep state. And he was continuously deployed by the Indian state to execute extrajudicial pacification campaigns across different regions. One of those, here we are, was in Assam. This was years before he even got to Punjab. He basically honed his aggressive tactics and his techniques in northeast India, in Assam. He was the Inspector General of Police in Assam during the height of an agitation in the early 1980s. It was known as the Assam Agitation. And his tactics there earned him severe criticism at the time from local civil society. He was a brutal bastard, even in Assam. Evidence of that? He was charged himself with personally kicking a young student demonstrator, this guy, Kargeshwar Talukdar, to death during a protest. He actually kicked this young man to death during a protest. And it earned Talukdar he became the first Shaheed, the first martyr of the Assam movement. And of course, he's still revered today as a martyr. But I was going to say unbelievably. No, quite believably, he was later acquitted of that crime by a Delhi court. Surprise, surprise. But the pattern was set. You know, basically, this is KPS Gill. This is the sort of man that we're talking about. He then became, because of his track record, of his brutality in suppressing any sort of political dissent, he then became the state's go-to instrument for crushing any other dissent through raw, brutal physical force. And the ultimate validation of this Gill doctrine came in 2002. And for those of you who might remember, in Gujarat, yes, remember Gujarat? Narendra Modi? Muslim riots? Well, surprise, surprise, guess who was involved in that? Following the awful riots, the pogroms in Gujarat, where thousands of Muslims died, the state government, led by Narendra Modi, brought KPS Gill out of retirement. They appointed him as the principal security advisor to the Gujarat state. So clearly what was going on here, deploying this super cop of Punjab, the political establishment in Gujarat, Narendra Modi again, and all his mates, signalled to the public and, of course, international observers that the rule of law in Gujarat in 2002 was being suspended in favour of a new security regime under KPS Gill that, as always, prioritised political containment over any sort of legal accountability. So his methods that he perfected in Punjab in the 1980s and 90s then became a permanent blueprint for Indian state control across that whole nation ever since. And it's still going on today, of course. So the legacy of this man, KPS Gill, it's deeply polarised, of course. But it does serve as that permanent fault line in the Indian political landscape, because to the corporate media, to the Godi media, the security establishment, New Delhi, the Brahmins, the Brahmanical elite, he is this indispensable hero who saved India from balkanization. And this is a man, even, who had a high-profile criminal conviction in 1996 for sexual harassment of a senior female Indian Administrative Service officer, a lady called Rupandil Bajaj. But he got away with that. His jail sentence was rather conveniently reduced to probation, and his state medals were then protected by the establishment. He basically avoided justice because the establishment takes care of its own. That is the sort of man that is idolised in India, a brutal bastard and a sex pervert. And to the rest of us, this man, the Butcher of Punjab, to the families, countless families of the disappeared in Punjab, his name, of course, represents a very, very different legacy. He is the symbol of unpunished state terror and absolute injustice. The true tragedy of his era, it's not just that thousands, tens of thousands of extrajudicial murders happened, but the Indian state enabled them to remain unpunished. No senior police commander from that era has ever been held accountable for crimes against humanity. So, you can ban and censor films like Satluj. You can erase data collected by Jaswant Singh Kalra as much as you want. But when you do that, you're not just defending the truth itself, you're proving the point. You're actually protecting the viability of the guild doctrine for the future. In other words, you're saying his methods were okay and we will reuse them in future. The state is recognised, the Indian state recognises, if the public is allowed to see this myth, this super cop myth, actually dismantled, then they inevitably begin to question, people start to question the actual foundational morality of India. So, I hope that makes clear the truth of KPS Gill, this man who is revered and idolised by so many Hindus. I wonder what their comments are really, if they know the truth of what this man truly represented. Let's move on. Section 25 of the Indian Constitution. Some of you might be familiar with this, many of you probably won't be. Watch my podcast tomorrow with Dr. Graywell. We will talk in great detail, interesting detail about this. It is, in fact, and most of you will be aware of at least the implications of it because you'll have heard of it. This is the section and the subsection in the Indian Constitution that essentially classifies Sikhs as Hindus. This is the controversial bit in the Indian Constitution that has formed countless arguments, debates, whatever, ever since. Watch my podcast tomorrow for more details about this. But anyway, why am I talking about this? Well, it has formed the basis of a lot of arguments about the Indian state. It should be a secular state. However, the Constitution, as it is written, says India is a secular state, but, and it is a big but, because of clauses like this, the Indian Constitution is not secular. It actually favours the Hindu religion. And that favouritism, and if you want more explanation of this, do watch my podcast tomorrow with Dr. Graywell. That allows the context of everything that has happened ever since to be contained within a pro-Hindu, a Hindu-centric framework. And believe it or not, that is what is happening today, even as we speak, with Narendra Modi. And I did pick up on this actually, and we don't have time to go into any detail about it, but the Caravan actually had this sort of interview a couple of days ago, yesterday I think it came out. It was a calculated, they actually said that this whole concept of the Hindification of India. It was a calculated majoritarian design from the very start, from partition, 1947. And by legally defining Sikhism not as any sort of distinct sovereign religion, but merely as just some sort of subset of Hinduism, it meant that under Indian legal frameworks, Sikhs are seen as Hindus, under Indian law, believe it or not. And that, unsurprisingly, is a huge problem. And that context then finds its ground in all sorts of different arenas. One of which, believe it or not, is now affecting this. Narendra Modi's visit, of course, to New Zealand coming up tomorrow. Actually, I think he lands tomorrow. Because this machinery of cultural assimilation, basically saying all Sikhs are Hindus, all Indians are Hindus, this homogenization of what an Indian is. We're all Indian, but actually we're all Hindus. Even the Sikhs are all Hindus. That's the narrative that is very slowly but very insidiously being rolled out, even, believe it or not, during this visit. And I'll explain why. Because it's playing out in real time. Now, Modi is visiting New Zealand. It's the first visit of an Indian leader in 40 years, apparently, to New Zealand. Welcoming Mr. Modi is a huge fanfare, a staged fanfare, a whole creation. Of course, we've got this official diplomatic itinerary that's focusing on, trade agreements, maritime security, blah, 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 the usual sort of stuff. But ahead of his arrival, there's all sorts of events that are being organised, these cultural events being organised in Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, under names like the Kia Ora Modi. So what is this all about? Well, on the surface, they're sort of marketed to the New Zealand public and local politicians as some wonderful festival. It's benign celebrations of Indian heritage and diaspora success. But of course, you dig a little bit deeper. What actually is going on here? Beneath all that lovely colourful folk dancing, corporate sponsorships, you name it, there is, of course, a highly coordinated, state-backed ideological operation going on here. So activists on the ground have looked at what's going on here, and they've realised just what's going on here. By utilising local temple networks, the mandirs, and secular community organisations as fronts, the Indian diplomatic machine, and of course all its Hindutva allies, are now deliberately monopolising the definition in New Zealand of what it means to be South Asian in the West. They are writing a new narrative. If you're Indian, this is what you are. So if you want a ticket to see a visiting dignitary or your local politician wanting to engage with this fastest growing demographic block in New Zealand, the Indian diaspora, you've got to go through, you're channeled deliberately through this ecosystem that is designed to persuade you that Indian national identity is only seen through a specific Hindu cultural view. In other words, all of us, Indians, are all essentially Hindus. It's a very sophisticated mechanism. It's very clever, but it's designed with that single goal in mind. So, of course, if you're a Sikh or a Muslim or whatever other minority in the diaspora in New Zealand, you're going to be a bit miffed about that because India is not Hindu. India, at least as it stands today, is a collection of all sorts of diverse cultures and languages and religions. But you would never know, would you, if you're a normal New Zealander, because you're faced with this sort of propaganda. Anyway, a quick one now just to finish off, and it is related to that, because there is fortunately a bit of a pushback, at least people are trying to push back on this. And it happened in Chhattisgarh, in the Chhattisgarh High Court over in West Bengal, because the court stepped directly into a huge argument that was raising in the schools. The court was forced to rule on a controversial state education circular that was issued in June, middle of June, which sought to mandate in schools the daily recitation of specific Hindu prayers. And these included the Saraswati Vandana, the Gayatri Mantra, and the Guru Mantra. So apologies if I pronounced those incorrectly. But basically, if you're at school, in government-run schools in West Bengal, you are obliged, you are forced to recite those mantras, those prayers, Hindu prayers. And the state administration aggressively defended this using good old, classic rhetoric. They said that these ancient verses they're not religious doctrines, but they're universal philosophical exercises. They're designed to foster patriotism and moral focus, was their defence. Really? In other words, we really know what it's all about. Anyway, the judge, Justice Amitendra Kishore Prasad, he pushed back against this and said no. And the state attempted to retreat in the courtroom by claiming that this circular hadn't yet been fully implemented. They sort of tried to backtrack on it. But the High Court issued a hugely important safeguard. It said, and it ruled explicitly, no child can be compelled or forced to recite these prayers in state-funded schools. Basically supporting that constitution, the allegedly secular constitution. They said the fundamental constitutional right to freedom of conscience and dissent, freedom of practicing your own religion is what matters. In other words, you cannot be forced, essentially, to convert to Hinduism, even through the back door. So, yeah, it's a relatively small story, but it just proves at least some part of the judiciary is recognising what's going on, and they are fighting back against it. There is a pushback on this, and rightly so. But, as I say, this war continues, and these are just hundreds of small battles that are having to be fought over and over again to push back against this deliberate agenda of Hindifying India. And as I always argue, I said, fine, have your Hindu Rashtra, but at the same time, you've got to allow Khalistan, you've got to allow an independent J&K, Tamil Nadu, wherever it happens to be, Manipur, Kerala, whatever. But each part of India must have its own right to self-determination. If you want a Hindu India, by all means have it. But at the same time, you've also got to allow everybody else to have their own Rashtras, Rajas. There you go. Right, let's move on now. Gosh, we've only got 8 minutes to zip through the comments. Now, I'm going to admit something on these comments. I've used AI. And I'm chuckling because I'm the last person on this planet to understand how to use AI, but I've used it. So the comments are slightly different. They're all the same comments, don't worry, nothing's changed. But it does mean it actually speeds up my process, because normally all the comments, I have to go into the comments, I cut it, I paste it onto a page, and then I have to set it all. It takes hours. So I've AI'd it. I've hopefully got something that automates the process. So what it does mean is that these comments zip through one by one. It speeds up the whole process. So if you notice a difference, that explains it. If you don't like it, let me know, and I'll go back to the painful old way. But hopefully it just speeds up the process. Anyway, on with the comments. And look who's first. It's James. Welcome back, James. ProPix TV. With a simple word. Yes, indeed. This was the first live show. James comes scooting in with a simple live. Yes, James. We got there. We got live in the end. I don't think anybody actually watched it live. And it's quite possible that when I was broadcasting live, it wasn't actually live. I don't think it was available. I might have pressed the wrong button. Anyway, we'll get there eventually. So hopefully you guys will. Somebody might join us live at some stage anyway, because we're going to institute a phone line as well. So if you want to call in, by all means call in, whichever part of the world you're in. We're going to eventually set up a phone system like on Surinder's show. If you've got something that you want to say, you can phone in, you can talk to me, you can ask me a question, you can be rude to me. I can't guarantee I'll answer back or whatever, I might cut you off, but it gives you guys an opportunity to talk to me live on air. How exciting is that? How utterly terrifying. Anyway, thank you, James. Yes, indeed, live. Not today, ironically, but yes, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays will be live. Thursdays, possibly, maybe live, otherwise pre-recorded like this show. And Fridays, as usual, will be the podcast. So that's the framework going forward. Stay safe. Yes, this was Joseph Goebbels, who has actually set the template for basically every authoritarian regime ever since. And Modi's regime is no different. If you tell a lie big enough and you tell it often enough, people start believing it. And this isn't actually, ironically, this isn't just specific to India. It's happened here in the UK. This happens in the West as well. Goebbels knew how to play that game, and he played it very well. And others have learnt from his example, India being a prime example. B. Singh. Of course, sorry, just on a completely unrelated note, for the benefit of Hardal Singh, you will notice, of course, the benefit of doing it this way. is that I can keep the logo on. It solves the old logo problem. B Singh says, India has just never been a democratic country. It is a killer country. Well, all I would refer you to is today's show. I think I've just in the last 45 minutes or 54 minutes, I just explained why your comment is absolutely bang on. Totally true. WHO Panzer contributed a lot, I think, in the last couple of days. So same comment, basically. The Hindu state is a terrorist state. It is the Indian state under Hindu majoritarianism has done nothing but kill, oppress, torture, rape minorities, not just the Sikhs, but other minorities as well. But ultimately, the freedom fighters, not terrorists, freedom fighters. When you're fighting in self-defense, as the Sikh community have had to do since 1947, they're not terrorists. This is what the Hindutva indoctrinated idiots in India have never understood. They're not terrorists if you're fighting in self-defense. You're literally fighting for your own right to breathe. The freedom fighters, by definition, not terrorists. We know who the terrorists are. And TC totally agrees with you on that one. Now, Abella, there was never a USA before 1776. There was never a Pakistan. Yeah. So what's your point? Well, I would actually go back to you and say, well, what's your point? The point is India was artificially created when the British arrived, when the East India Company arrived. So unlike the USA and unlike Pakistan and unlike many other examples, India has always been an artificial construct that was brought together by brute force and has never been allowed to then break apart like every other part that naturally should have broken apart. The United States is unlikely, God forbid, to ever break apart because it was much more of a natural joining together. They share common cultures. They share a common language. Same with Pakistan to a large degree. Australia, yeah, likewise. This is why your point is wrong, because India is a very, very different situation. It was artificially brought together of completely disparate cultures under colonial brute force that brought them together and has maintained that I won't say cohesion, has maintained it artificially together ever since, which is why it's still straining in those bonds to break apart. Pritam Kumar, Jaswant Singh Kalra. Well, I think you basically reiterate what I just said in the show. You're absolutely right. Bless him, Jaswant Singh Kalra, Bhai Kalra. He, the work he did lives on today. You can read Pritam Kumar's comment yourself, but basically, as you said, he did this forensic analysis. I mean, he was a bank worker, so he was obviously used to the attention to detail. Essentially, it's what got him killed because he was so good at what he did. He documented all the evidence, even keeping receipts of the wood, as you rightly say. He had that court-acceptable documentary evidence that can legally condemn the Indian state to the guilt of murder, mass murder, genocide. And that sadly got him killed. WHO Panzer. This is it's a long comment actually. Basically talking about, if I can remember it correctly, talking about the victimhood of Hinduism, Hinduphobia, and this is very much happening in North America, but it's not just North America. It's actually here in the UK as well. I've seen it. Is that there is this whole argument from the Hindu, particularly Hindutva. It's not Hindus as a whole. It's Hindutva trying to frame any criticism or accountability of Hindutva or the RSS or the Indian authoritarianism as Hinduphobia. They hate us. They're attacking us. No, it's not. It is just holding you to account. That is very different. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. So we don't have time to sort of go line by line. But you're totally right, WHO Pans, on that. Stay safe. Breaking news. US prosecutors arrest 24. Yes, huge story that I covered in yesterday's show. I think I don't need to get into more detail, but to me, it's the story of maybe this year so far. It's massive. And B Singh follows up. Yeah, you saw it on Punjab Politics Live. Many US top cops were speaking about it. And Stay Safe jumps in again. It's on MSM, mainstream news, BBC covering it, World Service. This is great. As I say, this is fantastic because the truth, you cannot keep a lid on the truth forever. It always comes out. And because of Satluj, the film Satluj, and everything behind it, because of what Jaswant Singh Kalra did, that evidence is never going to go away. And And that, of course, then it awakens people's sensitivities to anything to do with it. So when you get the Department of Justice in the US now talking about, we just arrested, 37 Indians for transnational oppression, for organised crime, etc., for murdering Khalistanis and Sikhs, people start putting the pieces together. Oh yeah, that's what that Satluj film was about. And they start to realise that what happened in 1980s, 1990s India, that they've now just learnt about, is still going on. That is the beauty of this multilateral information tsunami that all of us, in our own little way on this channel, but across bigger channels, everybody is out there. The production team for Satluj, everybody is playing a part. You guys individually are all playing a part. Every time you go out there with a Khalistan flag, every time you're out there protesting or being active, or just even having a conversation with somebody who's never heard of Khalistan or Punjab or whatever, all of you are playing your small part, which combined is getting the story, the narrative, the truth onto mainstream media. So don't stop. Preetam Kumar also comes back. If it's just KPS Gill's involvement, then why did they ban the film? He must have been a government tout to do. Well, again, Preetam, I'd refer you back to my quite robust takedown of KPS Gill. He was a nasty piece of work. Likewise, as you yourself have recognised. And Bishnoi, they're all. I mean, they all seem to be cut from the same mould. Actually, they are just a bunch of so and so's. They are evil people who are quite prepared to murder their fellow human beings for whatever political cause. Actually, I think people like KPS Gill didn't do it for politics. They did it for the love of it, because those people are psychopaths. I actually genuinely think KPS Gill was a psychopath. And I think that, in many ways, is what I was talking about earlier in the show. There's something in that man's eyes. There's something psychopathic in those eyes. And I think people like Lawrence Bishnoi, was he a psychopath? No, I think he's too clever to be. I often I won't say praise Bishnoi, but I recognise the guy is intelligent, and it's such a waste of a young life. He could have made so much of his life. He could have been in charge of a global billion-dollar company. Instead, he's in charge of a bunch of murderers. Why? Why waste your life, mate? Anyway, Preetam Kumar comes back again. And the film shuts the mouth of all books. It does. That film tells the truth. As I said in 2 days ago show, when we talked about the film, it's only 2 hours and a bit. You cannot tell the full story. It was just a flavour. It was a human story. But at least it gives a flavour of what it was all about. It provokes people to ask questions. What was this all about? Yeah, we heard about by Kalra's evidence that he collected, but what's the bigger story? Why was the Indian state targeting Sikhs? What had Sikhs done wrong? Why did they deserve that? It starts people's curiosity. That's really what matters. WHO Panzer again, been very busy. India isn't a democracy. Well, how right you are. Where is free speech? Who's the victim here? Etc. etc. Hindu phobia. It is. It's the victims are Hindus. Didn't you know? According to Hindus. And well, Abella, quite rude. I won't actually read that one out. And WHO Panzer comes back again. Actually said, look, many channels are popping up, and this is the same victimhood narrative that they're now trying to push. As soon as the Sikhs say, look, genocides, look what happened to us, up pops Hindutva to say, yeah, but look what happened to us. Tens of thousands of Hindus were murdered. Really? I see it myself regularly. But as B Singh says, no, it's a misquote. What he actually meant to say was 35,000 Sikhs were actually murdered, which actually is true. Well, the only untruth of that is it's an understatement. And Manjit Kaur pops in to say, hi Angus. Hello Manjit, I haven't seen you for a while. I know Manjit has been with us for a very long time, almost since the beginning. And I know you do pop in periodically just to say a good morning or a hi. So this is a big hi back to you, Manjit. Thanks for staying with us. And James is back again. The set looks good, Angus. So let me show you guys the set again. There you go. This is one of the sets. And interestingly, these books, you see all these encyclopedias. I mean, there's about a ton, literal weight ton of encyclopedias there. But let me let you into a little secret. All those encyclopedias are only that thick. They've got no pages because, of course, I need to move this sometimes. And if they're all real encyclopedias, I think I've got one here. Here's one of them. Look. It's not real. It's the magic of television. I'm like a magician telling you all my secrets. Anyway, on with the show, as they say. The set looks good. Thank you, James. Much appreciated. We do miss you, James. And as Stacey says, yeah, look, we still ask about you. Good to see you popping back in. Do keep popping in, James. It's nice to have a remote conversation with you and to say you're sorely missed. We do miss you, James. Gimon Grail, Sat Sri Akal, and a big Sat Sri Akal to all the audience. TC pops in, Chadi Kala, Vahiguruji Kakalsa, Vahiguruji Kifate. Absolutely. And the final words of the show go to both Murgi Vlogs, Raja, Khalistan Zindabad, Jaskarat Singh, Vahiguruji Chadikala, Khalistan Zindabad. Indeed. Oh, look, I'm still on the set. I was treating you to the set. I just realised. I'm not sure I was showing you the right camera angle. There you go. Just in case you wanted to see the magic of television. There you go. But yes, that's it for another day. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. I'll be back on Monday live. So do try and keep an eye out for that. 5 p.m. UK time. Please do pop in. It'd be nice to see somebody watching live because, you know, it's quite nice to know I'm not here alone doing it. But anyway, in the meantime, let me know your thoughts, comments. Email me, message@satlujtv.com. If you can make the live show, pop a comment, because I'll hopefully be monitoring comments as well if you want to comment whilst I'm broadcasting live. But that is it for another day. Do watch out for my podcast with Dr. Grail tomorrow. Fascinating one. We talk about Article 25 of the Constitution, but it does, of course, have enormous importance to everything to do with the Sikh community, even today. So do watch that. But that's it for another day. We're way over time. Why not? Let's throw caution to the wind. I hope you guys have a great weekend. See you in the podcast tomorrow. And if not, have a great weekend. Catch you guys next week.